In 1998, an old man of 81 sat down and wrote a letter to forgive the man who had tortured him. He carried it to Japan himself. The letter was delivered into an empty room. The man it was addressed to had refused to come. The man holding out forgiveness was Louis Zamperini, Olympic runner, airman, castaway, prisoner of war. The man who would not take it was a former camp guard named Mutsuhiro Watanabe. The prisoners had called him the Bird. Every version of this story ends here, on this act of grace. None of them asks the obvious question: why was the room empty? Why, 50 years later, was the Bird a free man with the standing to refuse? You know this story even if you have never read it. Unbroken, Laura Hillenbrand's 2010 bestseller, a World War II story of survival, resilience, and redemption. A plane goes down in the Pacific. A man survives 47 days on a raft, then 2 years in Japanese prison camps, then comes home and learns to forgive. It is an extraordinary book, and a true one. But a book is a frame. It decides where the story starts and where it stops. And this one stops at the edge of a ledger it never opens. Pull the thread of that empty room, and the redemption story comes up like a floorboard. Underneath it, a captor who was wanted and never tried. A biological warfare program the United States bought and buried. War criminals cleared by policy, one of whom became prime minister, and a prisoner whose name is in no edition of this book. The forgiveness is real. This is the file it closes before it opens. Start with the Bird. Mutsuhiro Watanabe was a guard at the Omori and Naoetsu prison camps, a corporal who had wanted to be an officer and never made it, and who took the failure out on the men in his charge. He singled Zamperini out, the famous Olympian, and beat him with a fixation the other prisoners remembered for the rest of their lives. When the war ended, the occupation authorities knew exactly who he was. General MacArthur's headquarters named Watanabe one of the 40 most wanted war criminals in all of Japan. And then, nothing happened to him. He walked out of his camp and disappeared into the mountains near Nagano. He hid for roughly 7 years. He was never arrested. He was never tried. He resurfaced, sold life insurance, and lived to be an old man. Because by the time anyone might have come for him, the machinery built to come for him had been deliberately switched off. That switch has a name. Historians call it the reverse course. In 1947 and 48, with the Cold War hardening, the Soviets in Eastern Europe, the Communists winning China, the United States changed its mind about occupied Japan. The mission had been to punish a defeated enemy and pull it apart. The new mission was to rebuild that same enemy, fast, into a stable, anti-communist ally. This was not a drift. It was a policy, written down. In 1948, the State Department's chief planner, George Kennan, flew to Tokyo, and his recommendations were codified that October in a National Security Council directive. Demilitarization slowed. The purge of wartime officials went into reverse, and the war crimes trials began to wind down. On the files of men marked for prosecution, you can watch the word change. Wanted becomes cleared. Watch who walks. Nobusuke Kishi had been a minister in Tojo's wartime cabinet. He co-signed Japan's declaration of war on the United States, and before that, ran the industrial economy of occupied Manchuria. After the surrender, he was arrested as a Class A war crimes suspect and locked in Sugamo prison alongside the men who would hang. He was never indicted. He was released without trial on Christmas Eve 1948. 9 years later, Nobusuke Kishi was the Prime Minister of Japan. Above even him sat a man the tribunal was never allowed to reach at all. Emperor Hirohito was shielded from prosecution as a matter of occupation strategy. MacArthur judged a cooperative emperor on the throne more useful than a defendant in the dock. The famous photograph of the towering general beside the small, formal emperor, taken in September 1945, is not a snapshot. It is the arrangement. The throne would legitimize the occupation, and in exchange, the throne would not be charged. And then the door was locked behind them. The San Francisco Peace Treaty, signed in 1951 and in force by the spring of 1952, ended the occupation and restored Japan's sovereignty. With it, the era of Allied war crimes prosecution effectively closed. No new tribunals would convene, and the prisoners still held were paroled in stages over the years that followed. That treaty is why the bird could resurface. The warrants against him were simply dropped. The room Zamperini walked into in 1998 was empty because half a century earlier, the United States had decided that this whole category of men was no longer to be pursued. To understand why a government would do that, would trade away the prosecution of an enemy it had just defeated, you have to look at the most valuable thing the deal was protecting. It was not the bird. It was a number. In the occupied countryside of Manchuria, at a complex called Pingfang, the Imperial Japanese Army had run a program called Unit 731. It was a biological warfare operation, and it tested its weapons on human beings. I am going to tell you the smallest amount about it that the story requires, and no more, because the people it killed are owed restraint, not spectacle. Prisoners were infected with plague and anthrax to study how they died. The conservative count of those killed inside that facility is around 3,000. The man who ran it was a general and a physician named Shiro Ishii. When the war ended, Ishii had something the United States wanted: the data. Years of human experimentation written up in reports, and the United States made him an offer. The offer was immunity. American investigators from the Army's Biological Weapons Center at Camp Detrick interrogated Ishii's scientists in 1947. One of them told the Japanese plainly that the inquiry was not concerned with war crimes. In March 1948, the Joint Chiefs of Staff formally placed the data in intelligence channels and stopped the prosecution. The summary report did the arithmetic out loud. The whole investigation had cost the United States about 250,000 yen, a sum the report itself called
a mere pittance.
Next to the millions of dollars and the years of work the program represented. They received a listing of some 8,000 pathological slides, human tissue, cataloged. And here is the part that turns the deal from a crime into a tragedy. When American scientists finally examined what they had bought, the data was judged to be of almost no real value. The United States traded the prosecution of mass murder for a stack of paper that was nearly worthless. Someone did try to put it on trial. In December 1949, the Soviet Union prosecuted 12 men of Unit 731 at a court in Khabarovsk. The charges were the manufacture and use of biological weapons and the experiments on living people. All 12 were convicted. The United States dismissed the Khabarovsk trial as communist propaganda, and the West ignored it for 30 years. Its findings were, in fact, substantially true. The public trial that the world did watch, the Great Tribunal at Tokyo, ran from 1946 to 48, and Unit 731 was kept out of it entirely. One of the Tokyo judges said so afterward, flatly. The worst of Japan's crimes, he said,
was kept secret from the court by the US government.
We know exactly what that choice looked like done the other way, because the same country made the opposite choice in Germany at the very same time. At Nuremberg, in the doctor's trial that opened in December 1946, American prosecutors put Nazi physicians in the dock for medical crimes, the same category of crime, human experimentation, that the United States was at that exact moment shielding in Japan. 16 of the 23 defendants were convicted. 7 were hanged. That trial produced the Nuremberg Code, the principle that you may never experiment on a human being without consent. So the rule was not unknown. The same nation that wrote the rule at Nuremberg suspended it for Ishii. The difference between a hanging and a handshake was which enemy the Cold War still needed. Now bring the ledger back down to the body, to a prison camp, and a man on a raft. Unbroken tells you the number itself, in passing, and it is worth stopping on. Of the nearly 35,000 Americans held prisoner by Japan, more than 12,000 died in captivity, more than 37 in every 100. By comparison, of the Americans held by Germany and Italy, only about 1 in 100 died. That is the world Zamperini survived, and it is the world the bird ran. Watanabe was not an aberration the system failed to catch. He was a line item the post-war accounting had already chosen to write off. One wanted man among a whole apparatus of wanted men, the United States decided, on purpose, to stop chasing. Which brings us back to the thing the book is actually about, the forgiveness. What the redemption story compresses into a chapter, the documents stretch into a decade. Zamperini came home from the camps and did not recover. He drank. He could not sleep. He had a recurring dream in which his hands were around the bird's throat. What the 1940s called battle fatigue, we would now call post-traumatic stress, and it nearly destroyed him. In 1949, he walked into a tent in Los Angeles where a young preacher named Billy Graham was holding a revival, and he walked out converted, and the nightmares stopped. That is the redemption, and it is real, and it is the part everyone keeps. Angelina Jolie's 2014 film of the book ends almost before this begins, at liberation, with the lost decade folded into a few lines of text on a black screen. The collapse, the drinking, the conversion, a sentence each. So ask the question the clean ending skips. When Zamperini forgave the bird, what exactly was he forgiving? The personal cruelty of one guard, or the entire machinery that made sure that guard would never answer for it? The book gives you the first. The file holds the second. And underneath the file, there is a name. His name was Frank Fujita. The men called him Fu. He was an American soldier, and he was Japanese-American, a Nisei, the son of an immigrant, captured by the country of his father's birth. He served in an artillery battalion out of Texas that surrendered on Java in 1942 and vanished into the camps so completely it was called the Lost Battalion. Of all the Americans Japan took prisoner in that war, only 2 were Nisei combat soldiers. Fujita was one of them. His captors singled him out for his face, pressured him to broadcast their propaganda, and the whole time, in secret, at the risk of his life, he kept a diary. He hid the pages in the walls. Those pages survived. After the war, Fujita's record was used to convict Japanese war criminals. The prosecution's the reverse course was busy shutting down everywhere else. He wrote it all into a memoir, Fu, a Japanese-American prisoner of the rising sun, published by a university press in 1993. He fits none of the redemption arc. There is no Olympic glory, no Hollywood adaptation, no torch. And so, in a book about that war's most famous prisoner, his name is nowhere to be found. So read The Empty Room again with the file open. An old man carries a letter across the world to forgive his torturer, and the torturer refuses, and can refuse, because the United States long ago decided this man would never be judged. The same decision that cleared Ishii, that freed Kishi, that spared the emperor, that called Khabarovsk a lie, and kept Nuremberg's rule only for Germans. Unbroken is a true book. It is also an unfinished one. It ends on the grace of a single man, and that grace is the best thing in the story. But underneath the famous letter sits the file of everything the redemption could not reach. The cleared, the bought, the buried, and the one witness whose name never made the page. The book closes the file. Open it.